Dr. Michael Gorin, Dr. Glenn Lopez, and Dr. Stephen Levy and Santos Cortez to discuss the health consequences of sugar-sweetened beverage consumption.
Senator Padilla, Senator Elquist, thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to talk a little bit about diabetes and the effect of sweetened beverages. I am a pediatric endocrinologist and a professor emerita at the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California. Right now, 24 million Americans have diabetes. 57 million Americans have prediabetes. Diabetes kills 1 American every 3 minutes. A new case is diagnosed every 40 seconds. 1 in 3 children born in the year 2000 or thereafter is expected to develop diabetes during their lifetime. Diabetes accounts for more deaths than AIDS and breast cancer combined. The average life expectancy is 15 years less than those without diabetes, and diabetes cost our nation $174 billion in 2007. So every 24 hours, there's 3,600 new cases, over 600 deaths, over 200 amputations, 120 people enter kidney failure, and there's 33 to 64 new cases of blindness as a result of diabetes. This is a rather complicated slide, but shows the results of a very important national study called the SEARCH trial. It's estimated that there's 160,000 youth with type 1 diabetes and 4,000 youth with type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, which is not related to diet, but is due to environmental factors that we cannot control and to a genetic predisposition, is not associated really with any kind of dietary intake. On the other hand, type 2 diabetes is markedly associated with obesity, and over the last decade, there's been a 10-fold increase in the number of youth with type 2 diabetes. It doesn't occur very often in children 0 to 9 years of age, but in children 10 to 19 years of age, it is one of the most common chronic diseases. Of the children developing diabetes, a third of African American and Hispanic youth now develop type 2 diabetes, and 2/3 of American Indian youth develop type 2 diabetes. The projected increase in the population with diabetes by 2020 for non-Latino whites is expected to increase about 25%, for non-Latino blacks about 55%, and for Latinos over 100%. This is just to show you that children with diabetes in youth between the ages of 10 and 19 actually start to develop cardiovascular risk factors. They develop hypertension, abnormal cholesterol, increased waist circumference, and the metabolic syndrome. And most children with type 2 diabetes have at least 2 of these risk factors, which put them at pretty significant risk for early cardiovascular events. This is kind of a layout of the cost of type 2 diabetes to our nation in 2007, and most of the cost goes to the treatment and to the complications. Actually, the significant increase over the last number of years has been in the cost of treating the complications of diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is an epidemic that's driven by obesity. Childhood obesity is driven by excess caloric intake and decreased energy expenditure, and is clearly associated with the increased consumption of sodas. There's ample data. I think we've all listened to it. But if we could ameliorate obesity in youth, we would ameliorate this increase in type 2 diabetes. Just want to quickly show you the very important National Institutes of Health study that's just being concluded in a cohort of children that we're following through 6th and 8th grade, so we're following them over a 3-year time period, and to reduce risk factors for type 2 diabetes. The main focus of this, as you can see, is nutrition goals, and the main nutrition goal is to decrease the consumption of sugar-added beverages. Many associations have recommended that children decrease their intake of sugar-added beverages. The American Heart Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics. I think Dr. Burnell covered this. and as well as the impressive study that was just covered from UCLA looking at the association of sugar-added beverage and childhood obesity. This is a slide that looks at the overall increase in diabetes over a time period, and if you can look at that green line, that's the increase in high fructose corn syrup intake, showing a rather kind of almost similar climb of both fructose intake and the increase in type 2 diabetes. So I just want to say that if we don't do something about the increase in type 2 diabetes in youth, it is likely, because it's diagnosed so early, within 20 years, when these youth are now young adults, we will significantly put them at risk for blindness, amputation, kidney failure, and early cardiovascular event. They would be the workforce of our nation. They would be the next generation of Americans raising the next generation, and we are imperiling them with a disease that could be prevented by dietary manipulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oops.
Next presentation, please.
Good morning. I gave you an old-fashioned handout. I think you have that. My name is Michael Gore, and I'm the director of the Childhood Obesity Research Center at the University of Southern California and a professor of preventive medicine and physiology and pediatrics. I want to switch the focus a little bit to talk about what happens inside the body when you take a gulp of the big gulp. Because we've heard a lot of information about the prevalence of the consumption, but the metabolic effects of sugar answers some of the questions, including your question, Senator Flores, about why minority groups might be more susceptible to the effects of high sugar consumption. So the first handout that you have just shows you some of the prevalence data. Hispanics in particular seem susceptible to high sugar intake. Mexico is the country in the world with the largest per capita consumption of sugar. And Hispanic teenagers in particular have a very high intake of sugar. And in a recent study, several studies that we have completed, looking at which dietary factors are associated with metabolic risk for diabetes, it is always sugar that pops out of the analysis, not fat or fiber or other nutrients, it's sugar. The second slide is very important because it answers your question. It shows you what happens when you consume sugar. When you consume sugar, the pancreas is stimulated to release insulin. Insulin is a hormone that clears glucose from the circulation. The requirement for insulin secretion, as you see here, rises exponentially with the degree of insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is greater in obesity, in puberty, and in minority people. Those factors are all additive. So if you have, for example, an obese Hispanic pubertal child, they're extremely insulin resistant, meaning they have an exponentially increased requirement to produce insulin. So the challenge of glucose every time to the pancreas is exponentially increased every time glucose is consumed. The other factor to consider is that high sugar intake, regardless of whether or not it contributes to obesity, and the evidence suggests it does, but regardless of that, there are negative metabolic effects of sugar on the body. And one of those is related to liver fat consumption, liver fat production. So the next slide in front of you of the MRI images shows you the MRI of an abdomen in two different Hispanic girls, as it would happen. One on the left who has no fatty liver, and on the right, this particular child, the liver is the large organ on the left in yellow, very high amounts of fat deposition in the liver. And fat deposition in the liver is very harmful to the body. So the question is, why do some people get fat in the liver and others don't? And one of those factors is sugar, and in particular,